So, first things first, we are going to have a quiz today, not today, by Friday. You'll have roughly Thursday and Friday to complete it. It's worth 10 points, same as the last one. I believe that will probably be the last quiz before the actual test. But also remember, you need to be completing that reading journal and everything so that when the test comes along, that's when you'll be turning in the first half of that. That's really easy. It's just your opinions about whatever you're reading that week, about 100 words worth. This quiz will be on the readings for the last couple of weeks and the lecture. So be sure to have caught up on the lecture and the readings. All right, so last time we left off, the U.S. had finally gained independence after several years of warfare, granted by the Paris Treaty in 1783. Now, before that actually happened, the U.S. had passed the Articles of Confederation, which a lot of today is going to be focused around how those articles failed. Because they were entirely too weak as a federal government. And as a result, we'll see a lot of conflict in the early republic. This entire period, roughly from the gaining independence to the War of 1812, is called the Early Republic. Hopefully we can get all the way to like John Adams this today, if I manage to speak quickly enough. One thing to note, though, I'm basically going to be completely excluding Indian warfare from this lecture because there will be several lectures dedicated to just the Indian Wars and exclusion at a later time. So, just to get a sense of what the U.S. looked like after the Revolution, this is kind of a map of the early republic. Now you can see that Florida here is not actually part. There's a bunch of unceded land all the way to the Mississippi. And then the original colonies, now states, claim that they own the land all the way to the Mississippi, and that's going to cause some conflict too, because each of these states can basically claim whatever they want. And some of them, in fact, have some pretty ridiculous claims. For instance, you see these two lines right here. That's Connecticut claiming land on the western side of Pennsylvania. So these claims were a source of friction, but we'll see that they end up being sorted out during this period. The other one is a map to where we're going, which is in 1800, where you can see several states are created in the West, but there's still some weird claims. Where basically Georgia is still claiming land. That's the only one that actually continues to claim. Well, North Carolina does too, but most of the western states are created by these ceded lands, even though they have no actual claim to them. It's just their claim, not a way to enforce it. So, first we have to get to the Articles of Confederation. Now, these were actually created in November of 1777, but throughout the Revolutionary War, they were not actually in force because the Continental Congress remained the War Congress during the war. But in 1781, the war was wrapping up. You had Yorktown, and the British Parliament actually had voted to cease trying to invade the United States. So effectively, the U.S. was already independent by 1781, and that is when the Articles of Confederation were fully ratified in March of 1781. So the Articles of Confederation were basically allowing a Congress to continue to exist. It was kind of an extension of the Continental Congress, but this new Confederated Congress is essentially only allowed to do what the states allow them to do. So if they wanted to pass a new tax, it had to be ratified by all the states, so they had to acquiesce to taxation. Can you see a bit of a problem developing from such a thing, right? You know, if you don't want to be taxed, you just say no. Well, how's the federal government going to get any kind of tax revenue to support this burgeoning nation in order to help defend the country from possible more British attacks, create a navy, any of that kind of stuff? Well, the Articles of Confederation actually make it so that there will be no army, no standing navy throughout this entire period. So think about that. In this early period, the U.S. didn't even have an army. Now, that's not to say there weren't elements left from the Continental Army. For instance, there were shore batteries, a single battalion's worth of men to arm the shore batteries. And of course, there were colonial militias that now are state militias. The state militias are still actually quite a powerful force, and we'll see when we get to the Indian Wars that they're continuing to engage in continuous fighting. But at this point, there's no standing army. Remember, a militia is just regular citizens called up. Many of the states actually have requirements at this point for every man of age to own a rifle, specifically so that they can be part of the militia. Many of the colonies had that, and many of the states continued that. By the way, I keep on saying many of the states. That's actually one of the primary things that if you read the Articles of Confederation, which you are supposed to be doing this week, last week, I think. But the articles keep on saying the many states. This is how they viewed themselves. They viewed themselves as separate entities, only brought together in loose confederation. So this is a very weak document. It doesn't allow for a very powerful centralized government. And so, of course, the first thing that they figure out that they can try to make some sort of money on is the territories, the area that is fairly unpopulated. The scheme is basically to sell that off. You can sell land and thereby gain money for the federal government, even though the states don't want to be taxed. But the states now have to relinquish all those weird claims that we saw in the previous slide. So many of these started being negotiated away from the states. For instance, as early as 1777, Connecticut started removing some of their claims to the far west. Realized far west is basically what we call Minnesota today, or Michigan. But You have negotiations with the British during the 1780s about trying to have them relinquish claims to forts throughout the Northwest Territory. It's actually not called the Northwest Territory at this point. It was still called the Indian Reserve. And there's several pushes to basically form new territories, starting off in 1777 with a proclamation called the Proclamation of New Connecticut, which basically created Vermont as an independent republic for a little bit, although they closely aligned with the Revolution. And in fact, provided rangers a lot of the time. The Vermont Rangers were quite a powerful fighting force. But eventually, the various claims were negotiated away from the states, and now there's a new swath of territory, basically that entire Indian territory that there was so much fighting over prior to the Revolution, is now in the hands of the federal government. And they also end up running into a new need for money, because they had promised pensions to all Continental soldiers. In fact, this is essentially how veterans would be paid for most of American history for their service, would be with pensions. That each major war ended and Congress would pass some sort of pension act. The last time this was actually in effect was during World War I. And a lot of the time, we'll see that this has some pretty furious pushback because the Congress can never really figure out how to fund these things. They can figure out how to spend enough money for the war, but to pay for the people who come back, that's a whole different issue. And veterans will continuously cause problems throughout this early republic period because of these pensions. They passed legislation saying that they will collect taxes for this in the 1770s, and then was recreated when the Army was reduced to that singular regiment I was talking about in 1784. But because you could see that really Congress doesn't have any way to collect any of these taxes that they need, right off the bat, as soldiers start mustering out of the Army, they start having troubles. For instance, during the war, there were several mutinies in the capital. But most importantly, in 1782, which is still technically during the war, but once again, the British weren't actually fighting or anything. So on May 22nd, 1782, a letter from a group of officers in Newburgh, Connecticut, was sent to Washington, saying that, and this was anonymously, my scheme, this I conceive would be done by having a savage and cruel enemy separated from their borders by a body of veterans that would be as an advanced guard, securing the main body from danger. This was talking about a coup. In 1783, the Continental Army was officially disbanded, and as they were starting to muster out, they continued to plot this supposed coup. On the 15th of March, 1783, Washington finally got wind of this, and he walked into the officers' quarters in Newburgh and started giving an address. And he came up to them and specifically said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country. You will give one more distinguished proof of unexampled patriotism and patient virtue, rising superior to the pressure of the most complicated sufferings." Because realize, they're mustering out and they're realizing that Congress can't pay them what they were promised. So they're plotting a coup, but this address, what is often called the Newburgh Address, basically saves the country from turning to civil war. If you look at the history of revolutions throughout world history, you will find that most major revolutions end in civil war. You see it in France, you see it in Russia, every place you can think of. I mean, even Ireland. It turns from revolution to civil war. And that was stopped by this speech. Because, they felt a sense of patriotism and that they didn't want to go against this leader who had helped them get through this major war. But instead, in June, 400 soldiers refused orders and took positions all throughout Philadelphia, which is still the capital at this point. And then Pennsylvania refused to intervene by sending militia to stop the regular army. So there was actually a coup attempt, but this was enlisted soldiers rather than officers. So they're seen as like the mob. In fact, throughout the rest of this semester, the enlisted soldiers are typically seen as kind of brutes that people to be herded off to the slaughter. The officers are the people who matter. There's a lot of elitism in the early republic. And in fact, you'll see even General Winfield Scott, the first Supreme Commander during the Civil War, says the same thing about enlisted men, freaking, 7 years from now. So there is this kind of feeling that the mob needs to be put down. That it's essentially a riot in Philadelphia, but Pennsylvania refuses, and so Congress has to relocate, moving to Princeton, New Jersey, which this kind of instilled a realization that if you don't have control over the land that Congress is on, as in some sort of federal district, then you're dependent on that state, and that state might choose not to intervene. This is the reason why we have a District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., but that's later. But you can see they're already experiencing problems because of these Articles of Confederation. There's no way to muster out an army or to federalize a militia when need be. But they do have those state sessions to be able to start getting some sort of tax revenue. Remember, a lot of this is about pensions. Specifically how to pay for veterans coming home. And so they create the Northwest Ordinance, well, first the 1784 Land Ordinance, which allows the federal government to sell blocks of land. And in fact, in a very specific pattern. There's these large blocks of land that are divided and subdivided in a particular way that comes out to 160 acres. This 160 acres is will remain pivotal and will actually be one of the main points called the Homestead Act that will lead to the Civil War. You can see a lot of the seeds of conflict to come in the conflict that is already here in the 1780s. And the Northwest Ordinance, the Land Ordinance, the first one, said specifically that it would create some sort of temporary government and for the areas in that northwest area. They don't have a discrete way of doing it yet. It just says that first, that they shall have forever remain a part of the Confederacy of the United States of America. Second, that they shall be subject to the Articles of Confederation in all those cases, blah, blah, blah. Third, that they in no case shall interfere with the primary disposal of the soil of the United States and Congress. Fourth, that they shall be subject to pay a part of federal debts. Fifth, that no tax shall be imposed on lands the property of the United States, as in like the local government cannot impose taxes on the federal government, confederated government technically. Sixth, that their respective governments shall remain Republican, not referring to the party. The Republican Party doesn't come around until 1854, so that's a long ways away. When they're saying Republican, they're talking about a representative form of government. And seventh, that the lands of non-resident proprietors shall in no case be taxed higher than those of residents. And that they shall have the ability to vote for delegates to Congress. So they're already kind of starting to figure out how to make a territory, but in 1787, the actual Northwest Territory was created with a general as its governor. You'll find that a lot of these early territories are kind of founded as military strongholds, that they're ran by the military, even though it's technically a civilian government. Part of this is because of the Indian Wars, which we will get to eventually. It says also, and very importantly, that the ordinance says, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. We don't need to go through all of it. It also says that for Indians on said territory, the utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent, and in their property, rights, and liberty they shall never be invaded or disturbed unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. You'll see there's already seeds for the Northwest Indian Wars in that, because as long as Congress authorizes it, then it's good, right? And you can take as much land as you want. So, we have seeds of conflict to come, right? There's already a division between the Northwest Territories and the Southwest Territories in terms of slavery. There's already a way of dispossessing Indians through conflict. These are things that are built into the earliest laws, and the Northwest Ordinance actually remains a law today. It's the only law that actually carries over from the Articles of Confederation. It was passed again in 1791 once we have a different constitution, which we're getting to. So you have all this stuff in terms of the Northwest Ordinance. They're starting to get money, but it's not adequate. Veterans are still not getting the pensions they were promised. And finally, it reaches a breaking point in Massachusetts, where in August of 1786, this guy named Daniel Shays, so technically it's not called Shays' Rebellion, it's Shays' Rebellion, but nobody calls it that. But Daniel Shays organizes a rebellion, specifically to march on the capital of Massachusetts, Boston at this point, and try to basically take what they deserve, right? They want their pensions. And so they take a few courts and that were ruling against debtors, because realize this is 1787. This is 6 years after the war is done. They've had 6 years of not really getting their pensions that they're supposed to be getting, and now they're running into debts. And the court is, because if you want to evict somebody, if you want to garnish somebody's wages, or in this case their crops, their yield of crops or anything along those lines, you have to get a court ruling. Well, the court can't rule on debts if it's taken by an unruly mob, right? So they take over a few Massachusetts courts. And in return, the first of several riot acts was passed by Samuel Adams. Remember, Samuel Adams was kind of the leader of the Sons of Liberty, but now he's saying that essentially any freaking colonial militia can come out, read the riot act, which is literally you have to read it out loud, saying like, "You are now declared a riot," and then they're free to kill however many rioters they want. This was passed by Samuel Adams, of all people. And it's basically a copy of what the British had. Riot acts will continue to be reformulated, and that whole reading part doesn't remain a requirement for very long in the States. But you can see this is a pretty crazy situation when you have the leaders of the Sons of Liberty trying to put down a riot. And this rebellion actually continues all the way into June of 1787. There's fighting all over the place, and in fact, it doesn't really end until in January of 1787, General Lincoln, a major general in the Continental Army until he was mustered out, and actually a member of the Newburgh Conspiracy, led a Massachusetts militia specifically to defeat this, because once Shays was successful in taking a bunch of these courts, they now have reason for everywhere else to rise up. And so there's little rebellions throughout all of Massachusetts. But as soon as Lincoln, not Abraham Lincoln, but a different one, rides out with a state militia, there is basically no one willing to resist a proper force. It's the same thing that we see. Think about every time there's some sort of riot here, even this year. As soon as well, it's no longer called the militia, the National Guard rides out, the riot's done, right? Nobody wants to try to fight an actual army. So instead, they disperse. And so, same thing happened here. It took a few months before all the fighting was done, but essentially it was done. But you can see there's a lot of problems here. There's all these, the Articles of Confederation are not working. You know, you can't get pensions to people. They're, trying to, take over the federal government. They mutiny, they rebel. You've got problems in terms of, what's happening in the South. The South is essentially just continuing to claim all of those lands and expanding however they want. Virginia claims, the entirety of the Northwest Territory, despite the fact that it's now a separate territory. So the federal Congress doesn't have any means of stopping that. So finally, people start doing something about that. In 1786, the Annapolis Convention came together to specifically start proposing ideas of how to deal with these issues. So even before Shays' Rebellion, they're actually trying to figure out some sort of solution. So they first say, why don't we just make a new constitution? And in fact, one of the things that the Annapolis Convention tries to deal with is that the states had started taxing each other. They had imposed tariffs on each other. And so, can't get any kind of federal tax, but they can tax each other, apparently. Well, that was actually one of the things that the Annapolis Convention was trying to deal with. Also, Vermont is still an independent republic at this point, so they're trying to figure out how to deal with that. And even New York was threatening to secede, despite the fact that the Articles of Confederation explicitly state that the Union is forever. And you will see that the secession fears will continue to be a problem, even in the North. Because, you can say that the Union is perpetual all you want. That doesn't make it so, right? The only way to make it so is to have some way of forcing it. And yet, with all of this stuff, we have to also remember there's no standing army. There's no standing navy. Freaking Americans are getting attacked, especially on the north coast of Africa. There's a series of states called the Barbary Pirates that raid out from their shores and keep on attacking Americans. In fact, at this point, there's about 100 of them that had been enslaved by these northern African pirates. And so they're demanding ransom, and there's no way for Congress to give them that ransom money. By the way, the U.S. really actually likes negotiating with terrorists quite a bit. So even the person who said that that the U.S. does not negotiate with terrorists, as in Ronald Reagan, had specifically been doing so for years by the point that he had said that. We actually negotiate with terrorists all the time. And part of the U.S. Constitution was trying to solve that, to give Congress the power to negotiate with pirates. And mind you, at this point, pirates are seen as the scum of the earth, that basically as soon as you capture them, you execute them. Even though technically they're operating under letters of marque, so they're often called Barbary corsairs. But the U.S. doesn't recognize Muslim letters of marque. The U.S. saw them as purely pirates. So, with all of that, Spain closes New Orleans to U.S. trade, specifically because the U.S. has no power to enforce that the U.S. has no standing navy. All of this coming together, finally, in the 25th of May through the 17th of September, all 13 states, met in Philadelphia again, right in Independence Hall, and with the intent of technically just revising the Articles of Confederation. They don't actually end up revising them. Instead, they realize, no, the articles are utter rubbish. We need to start over again. We need a new constitution. So they come up with a number of innovations. For instance, checks and balances. Based off of a philosopher named Montesquieu from France, the idea is basically you have 3 separate branches of government that are co-equal, that they have a way of checking each other's power. So, for instance, the Supreme Court, what we have today, though it's not actually in the Constitution, can rule about laws from the bench. The Congress has the ability to confirm judicial appointments, and of course, the president appoints Supreme Court judges. So you can see there's this ability of all the different branches to kind of bite at each other and to keep each other in check, because the founders are extremely paranoid of there being a new king. After all, they had just rebelled against monarchy. They don't want it to come about again. One could easily see that the president today would be viewed as such a king by the founders, and would have been all the way since the 1860s. That the founders would have found that basically every president since the Civil War was basically a monarch. That's how paranoid they were of supreme power. So they also had a few compromises to try to deal with the various factions, especially between the North and South. So, for instance, the South is fairly unpopulated compared to the North. So, first there was the Virginia proposal, which proposed that that there would just be a Senate, essentially 2 delegates for every state, so that all states are co-equal and it doesn't matter how much population it is. And then there was the New York proposal. Can you guess what they proposed instead? Population representation, right? That votes should be purely about population. So how do they compromise between the two? Connecticut just says, why not both? And so we get a bicameral legislature. You have a House of Representatives, which at this point have a specific amount of people that they represent. In fact, the only reason why it got capped and is now, that each representative represents, hundreds of thousands of people, is because they ended up running out of space in the House for chairs. That's the actual reason why it's no longer that. But that wouldn't happen for a century. up until this point, there is a specific amount of people that each representative represents. I believe it's 60,000, if I'm correct. I do not have it in my notes. But how these representatives are calculated becomes another sectional issue. Because, you have the South who feel that they are not being represented if it's purely about the number of voters. And they propose that slaves should be counted as full persons. Contrary to what you will often hear about 3/5 of a person, the 3/5 compromise is actually trying to remove power from slaveholders by saying that no, slaves don't count as a full vote since they don't vote. Instead, it is 3/5 of a vote. This matters in terms of how many congressional seats you have in the House. This also matters for another compromise, which was the Electoral College. The Electoral College is how we vote for presidents. We don't actually vote directly for a president. We vote for electors. Each state gets a certain number of electors, roughly correspondent with the number of congressional seats they have. So you have, here I think it's 4, right? 4 or 5. Yeah, how many House members do we have? I think we have 2 House members, so we get 4 electors. Though that will probably change with this new census. Each census, by the way, is required by the Constitution specifically to count these votes. That's why we have a pretty good idea about how many slaves people had, because it was required by the Constitution to count them in the census. So with that 3/5 compromise, the North doesn't have to face complete Southern control of the federal government, but the South doesn't lose its power simply because, slavery. What a thing to lose power over, right? So, this also says that there is a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution as well. That essentially, it doesn't actually say slavery, it's that it basically says that labor contracts will be enforced across all borders. But in reality, it's just saying, if a slave escapes to New York, New York is actually a slave state at this point. If a slave escapes to like Massachusetts, then the slave doesn't instantly become free. Slave owners can do something about that. That's not clear, and that will actually continue to be a problem all the way until the Civil War. And will inspire fighting between the states continuously. There's already some fighting between Pennsylvania and Virginia as this is going on. There are literal mobs trying to go into Pennsylvania and capture escaped slaves, and people are dying already. So if people want to say that there was no fighting over slavery until the Civil War, no. It's basically constant throughout the entirety of American history until the Civil War. And then the Civil War, of course, is very much about slavery. So, with all of that, now they have to actually ratify the Constitution. Because remember, the Articles of Confederation weren't ratified until 1781, even though they were passed in 1777. 1777. That's hard to say. And so a group of people led by a young and up-and-coming philosopher named Alexander Hamilton, you might have heard of him, start putting out pamphlets known as the Federalist Papers. The most important of which being Federalist Paper number 10, which you guys will be reading. That was written by James Madison. But he basically organizes a pamphlet writing, a letter writing campaign to basically explain what the Constitution is, how it's supposed to work, and why it's a good thing. The Federalists also encounter anti-Federalists, people like then Ambassador to France, Thomas Jefferson, who very much was opposed to the U.S. Constitution, though he was not actually a member of it. So anytime you hear people talking about what Jefferson meant by the Constitution, he wasn't there, he didn't like it, and he actually did not want its ratification. He campaigned against it. So, don't listen to anybody who says that Jefferson has an opinion on the Constitution, because it doesn't matter. But now it's all about convincing the states to ratify it. And one after another, the dominoes fall, and eventually in 1788, June of 1788, it was fully ratified, which meant that it went into effect on the 4th of March, 1789. And finally, there was also this big debate in the actual Constitutional Convention that, what about rights? We are not saying anything about rights. We fought this entire war about the right not to be taxed without representation, and yet now we're not even talking about it. Remember the Bill of Rights for Englishmen was passed in 1689, and there'd been a series of Bill of Rights passed by the states during and after the Revolution, especially in Virginia, which happened to have been written by Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson does have a lot to say about the rights of the Constitution. And so the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were put out for ratification on the 25th of September, 1789, but it wouldn't be until the 15th of December, 1791, that they were actually ratified. So for 2 years under the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights was not part of it. And I believe you are also reading the Bill of Rights this week. This is where we get the whole freedom of speech, separation of church and government, and that. These are all shorthands for what the Constitution actually says. Because it doesn't actually say that we have absolute freedom of speech. It doesn't actually say that there will be a separation of church and state. Those are all terms that come later, basically through the Supreme Court's interpretation of it. Although the separation of church and state is actually something from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote during his, in 1801. But in either case, a lot of what we think of as our rights come from interpreting this document, not from the document itself. Otherwise known as the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. But finally, we have a constitution. Next step is getting elections going. And one person runs completely unopposed for the first presidential election. And that was George Washington. So, George Washington actually didn't really have much of an election the first go-around. I think it was 4 states actually held elections Two of them did it by essentially what you could call mail-in ballots, I guess. But very few people actually participated in this because some of the states did not even have had not ratified the Constitution, and they still were having trouble figuring out how to even do this, right? Because according to the Constitution, states run elections. There will be trouble with this following the revolution, and will eventually lead all the way until 1965, when local governments finally get forced to give voting rights, constitutional voting rights, to people, despite the fact that the federal government doesn't actually have any enforcement power. That 1965 Act is finally what gives the federal government some sort of enforcement ability. So all the way until then, the federal government basically doesn't have the power to control how votes are given. And that's also why the first election was from 1788 to 1789. It took an entire year to do a presidential election the first go around, and most states didn't even participate. But with Washington elected unanimously, electors chose John Adams as his vice president, and the New York actually held a vote, and they completely forgot to send electors to the Electoral College. So essentially, they had a vote, but didn't actually vote. That's how messed up this first election was. But of course, Washington was running unopposed, so they just chose Adams willy-nilly as the vice president. Vice presidents at this point were supposed to be the person who got the second most electors. But Washington ran unopposed, so they just chose somebody. Probably because of Adams' close affiliation with Washington at this point. Though Washington would try to act like he wasn't part of any faction that would start to grow during his administration, he was very much a Federalist. Even though he was a Southern slave owner, he was still very much a Federalist, and you'll find that a lot of the early parties weren't sectional. That, like the federal, James Madison was a slaveholder, and yet he was a very prominent Federalist. And actually, contrary to the recent movie, so was Alexander Hamilton. He was a slaveholder. In fact, he was actually a slave dealer for his wife's family, but don't need to go into the inaccuracies of that. The point being, the Federalists basically take control of the government very early on, even though they're not actually a party yet. And there's, right at the beginning, suddenly we have to figure out all this legislation to get the government working. Remember, they repassed the 1787 Northwest Ordinance in 1791. And there's a bunch of acts in 1791. And they've passed the Militia Acts, start passing the Militia Acts, there's actually several of them, in 1792, which actually says that the militia can finally be federalized. And that all, quote, free, able-bodied white male citizens, unquote, are able to be conscripted into the militia. So, contrary to popular belief, there's conscription in the U.S. from 1792 onward. But conscription into the militia is different from conscription into the regular army. The regular army doesn't actually get repassed until 1792 as well. But we'll get to that with the Indian Wars. Then, within Washington's cabinet, there's already sectional issues and the growth of factions. So, especially you have Alexander Hamilton, who is really worried about state debts. He wants to basically create a system that will force the states to be indebted to the federal government and also make rich people engaged in that system. He actually doesn't want to remove state debts, he wants to grow them. But he wants the federal government to take control of that. And there's also the issue of where to put the capital. Because, remember that whole thing with the mutiny in Philadelphia? Well, now they've got to create an actual District of Columbia. So, Jefferson and James Madison come to negotiate with Alexander Hamilton, and they come to a compromise and allow Hamilton to create a national bank at the same time as putting the capital in the South, right there on the border between Virginia and Maryland. Even though it's currently all in Maryland, the original borders of it included a chunk of the stuff across the river in Virginia, which happened to be a lot of land owned by Washington, so there's a bit of corruption in this deal already. But corruption and American government go hand in hand for more than a century. So that's known as the Compromise of 1790, and it creates the first bank. The bank is chartered in February of 1791, and the charter lasts for 20 years. So, and Hamilton becomes the first Secretary of the Treasury as a result. With all this, they also start trying to pass taxes, and one of the first taxes is to start taxing whiskey. There was, in 1789, the passage of tariffs and excise taxes. Now, an excise tax is basically all units of alcohol created are taxed in a certain way. It also says that alcohol has to be created in a particular way. It's in fact how many countries still run their distilling system. For instance, Britain and Ireland still run the same excise tax they've had for centuries. And this is basically just recreating that. But with a bunch of farmers who, they're creating a lot of barley and wheat and whatnot, and they want to try to export it, but they can't export it without it going rotten, so they distill it and turn it into whiskey. So this is quite a burden on rural farmers in upstate Pennsylvania. So they start rebelling. From 1791 to 95, backwoodsmen started just attacking tax collectors. Most of this was pretty bloodless, but in 1794, they attacked a U.S. Marshal. And the U.S. Marshal managed to kill one in self-defense before 500 of them stormed his house later on that night. So Washington, and the first and only time of a sitting president, leads an army of 13,000 men to try to stop the rebels. So while all of this is happening, there's a lot of tension going on between Britain, France, specifically over France's revolution. And the backwoods of Pennsylvania happen to have some places where the British are still holding forts. So this became a problem, to say the least. Basically, the U.S. had to decide which side to take, Britain or France. Well, the Federalists were elitists. They believed in, the idea that only people with property and good education should be the leaders. Another thing that this Hamilton show really gets wrong is it paints him as some sort of Democrat, and oh no, he hated the idea of the rabble being able to vote. Washington sends John Jay to go negotiate with Britain instead, and they create the Jay Treaty. This was such a departure from what most Americans actually wanted, which was more alliance with France after, having fought a war against Britain, that many cities burned Jay in effigy. This actually became kind of a standard thing for a year. And in 1796, the treaty became effective, saying basically the U.S. will remain neutral throughout the wars between France and Britain. And they also start treating with the pirates, specifically sending money to the Barbary pirates. All of this was actually seen as kind of a failure of the Washington administration. We often think of Washington as one of our best presidents, but at the time, by his second term in office, he was seen as a failure. He had turned away from our allies. He had started negotiating with pirates. And he had freaking led an army against his own citizens. In fact, at one point in Philadelphia, because at this point, actually no, I think it was in New York, because the capital kept moving around, and even though they had passed where the capital would be in 1790, it wouldn't be built until basically 1800. So the capital kept on bouncing around. But an angry mob literally showed up in front of Washington's house, demanding that he end the Jay Treaty. So that's how much of a faltering administration it was. But, which I believe you will also be reading this, he ends his presidency fairly magnanimously. Instead of running again, which there are no term limits at this point, he decides to set a precedent by stepping down. And when he steps down, he very specifically stated that the U.S. should avoid entangling alliances, factionalism, and sectionalism. Remember, all of which he had participated in. He was basically a Federalist. But his election would be the last time that parties do not factor in to a presidential election. So instead, the first party system came into being. Now, I don't think we have enough time to talk about that. No, we don't. So instead, let's turn this around real quick. Don't need to take that down because we'll be talking about it next time. How much of this is new to you that, Washington was kind of seen as a failure at the time? That he went against the will of the people, and that his farewell address was kind of like him finally making redress for all of his failures. And why is that important to understand?
Would it kind of be like the lessons that we never really learned? Like, he kind of warned us about having political parties and how it would always divide us in a way, but yet, to this day, we are divided in like half.
That's
two political parties.
Yeah, and remember, there's no, like, absolute answer to this. This is an open question. And yeah, one way of seeing it is that, like, that this is something, all of his mistakes were something to learn from and not make again, but we just keep making them over and over and over again, don't we? You know, we still have a party system. I mean, I don't think the party system, I think the party system is probably necessary in the way that we vote, which is called a first past the post system, as in anybody who makes it past a certain number of votes is elected. There's no kind of referendum, so third parties basically are useless. But he sees that coming, and the first party system is a result of exactly what he sees happening within his own administration, right? What else? Like, what else can we see from Washington's failures? Turns it around in that farewell address, doesn't he, right? What does that do? You notice that no president all the way until the 1930s would be elected more than twice?
So would it be that he kind of sets the boundaries to what a president should be?
Yeah, he sets the precedent of the president. Right? Yeah, it's very much setting a precedent. You know, not only is he trying to express, like, learn from my mistakes, but also, look, I tried to, because you could look at, like, the Jay Treaty, for instance, as instead of being a violation of the US-French alliance, which technically was still in effect, even though they had just executed their king, who was actually the signatory to it. So there's a bit of an argument to be had on whether or not we were still allied with them. But most Americans saw that as a betrayal of the alliance, hence why they were burning Jay in effigy. And, you know, basically attacking Washington's residents. But instead of just learning from that, he's also setting a precedent that he's saying, like, hey, look, presidents should be limited. That, you know, I tried to not engage in another war. I tried not to allow the government to devolve into, you know, a north-south battle. You know, he tried these things, and that's the precedent he set, an example. And that's why a lot of people see him as the best president, because he set the precedent for the president. But also, you know, we can see this period as kind of a series of mistakes, right? That there's, like, the attempt at the Articles of Confederation, and that devolves because they can't pay for veterans' pensions. They kept on trying to, you know, come up with new ways of dealing with that situation. And then even the Constitution is just a series of compromises, right? It's by no means a perfect document, hence why there's an entire mechanism built into it to amend it. But what does this really show us? What's the significance of all of these mistakes? What does it mean for American history that we made all of these mistakes?
Would it be kind of like the first stepping stone, because most of the like the amendments for one were stuff that they thought was a good idea to add, and then it's just like if it didn't work, then they can remove it, right? Yeah. I mean, you can see it as like the growing pains of a new republic, right? To quote Friedrich Nietzsche, that which doesn't hurt you only makes you stronger. These are all things that
I mean, that which doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. The point is, these mistakes were kind of necessary, weren't they? Like, we needed to make them. It's just the same thing with, like, when you have a child that, you know, you kind of have to let them make mistakes, right? They need to learn that fire is hot the hard way. You know, you can tell them all you want not to touch the fire. Eventually they're going to do it and learn fire is hot. Same thing is going on here, right? This is a whole new project. This is you know, they're just making it up as they're going along. You know, for all the nobility of these documents that you will be reading and the flowery language and all that kind of stuff, and all the basis in philosophy and all that kind of stuff, it's still very much a broken system. Even today. You know, think about it. How many presidents have we elected by popular vote in the last since the year 2000? We've had 3 presidents, and only one of them have been elected by popular vote. Both Bush and Trump were elected because of this electoral college, a legacy of this compromise, a legacy of this elitism built into the Constitution. And all of it is growing pains. That's where I guess we'll leave it off there. Any questions? Have a good day.